All right, welcome back to the Iron Sights podcast. I've got a guest for the second time. We had him on a little while back. His name is Eric Tung. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it, man.
Always good talking to you. Always good kind of chatting back and forth. There's so many cool things that you've done since I talked to you last time, and I think it's important that we kind of get you introduced for those people who maybe didn't listen. And maybe you could just tell them a little bit about who you are, what you do, kind of give the Reader's Digest version, and we'll jump right in because I got lots of questions for you on some stuff tonight.
Yeah, man, we'll go. So I am a Washington State police officer. I'm currently a patrol commander. So that's a mid-manager for us, command staff. I supervise a watch, whole side. So day shifter, graveyard, 4 different sergeants and crews. I also oversee our wellness efforts at the PD. So I've been in the job for 17 years. This is what I've been doing since I got out of college, in the area, largely from and grew up in the area. And this is my jam. So largely K9, riot response, FTO, so that's field training officer, patrol, neighborhood response, recruiting. So a hodgepodge of different things shoved in that time there.
So so you mentioned something there at the end, you just kind of glossed over it, and that was the recruiting part. Mm-hmm. And that I think that plays largely into a lot of the questions that I have to you today for you. And another thing is that you've been an officer, you've been on for 17 years. You're not a spring chicken, but you're also not an old dude.
Thank you.
Yeah, you've been doing this a while. And I love listening to Blue Grit Radio and what you're doing with Blue Grit, because it is very refreshing, and you come at it from a kind of a fresh, I would say kind of I don't know if this is the right term or not, but like a young mindset. It's like, hey, let's look at things in a different light, not in an ignorant way, not in a naive way. I think you take a very introspective approach to it, and it's very practical in a lot of ways. And the guests that you have on are awesome. I always take a lot away. I just listened to a few. I kind of binged you the other day because one of them came across, or the one you just dropped this, like we're recording this on a Wednesday, you dropped it on Monday. I heard a clip on Sunday that you used to tease it up. I was like, man, I got to listen to this. And it was about identity, and we're going to get back to that. But then I ended up binging you a little bit and kind of listening to some other ones and hearing my buddy Joey, the 9mm Musashi was on there. And again, there's just a little deeper level conversation that's happening there. And it seems to be like more solutions minded type guests that you have on, and they're coming at it from all different angles. And so me trying to keep my finger on the pulse of things, and just try to understand things better, particularly from the law enforcement side. You're the type of dude I like talking to because you're open for questions, and you're always going to come at them with a very thorough, thoughtful answer. So I dropped this on you kind of impromptu. So I want to thank you for joining me on such late notice to do this. But I felt really compelled to talk about this because I've recently been involved in some conversations, talk with you, because I've recently been involved in some conversations based on some other interviews and then some other kind of on-the-side conversations that I've had that really have my wheels turning. And part of it is there's some anxiousness to it because I don't have answers, and I'm just an answer type of dude. I like to get to the bottom of things. But what makes me a little bit more anxious about it is neither do the guys that I talk to. So I'm not expecting answers from you. I'm just looking for a good conversation that sparks maybe a different way of thinking about things. I don't know what that's going to be. So this is very much, we're just going to go down this road, try to keep it, we won't get too far off the rails. But that's just kind of a setup for today.
Yeah, man, I'm excited. I will throw this out. One is that when you reached out, it was a lot for me in a good way, in that, there's other stuff going on, but I was excited to come on because it hit you in such a way, which means that it's a very relevant topic. This is frequently on both of our minds. And I appreciate the compliments for sure. And in highlighting, I don't have all the answers. I'm just a dude. And even when you say this like young approach, in a lot of ways, the irony is that a lot of these things are not new. They're old. They're super, like stoicism's like, that's ancient. Like as far as like these things that a lot of us, and I think that these more constructive minded folks such as yourself, looking for solutions, looking to ask the right questions and stay curious, along with our buddy Joey, right? Like he's rooted in Musashi, right? And so like, again, feudal philosophy and these things that have always existed, but then how do we mobilize this for our cultures? And for me, that's the police industry. And how do we take these classic lessons from ancient old dudes, right? And then current old dudes, like so many leaders in so many industries, and roll it back together into essentially what my passion project is Blue Grit. How do we make ourselves better as cops, more resilient, and lead ourselves and not rely on other people to do it?
So I think that transcends so many things just in life too, and that's what I enjoy listening to. Is it's not just for cops, it's for everybody. But your target audience is cops, and relating back to the stoicism and the old kind of way of thinking, there's something to that.
Mhm.
And I want to talk a little bit about that. And so, kind of talking about history a little bit, whether it's philosophy or whatever, I just kind of set this up. I think what I want to talk to you about specifically is change and how change has been happening, and certain events maybe have accelerated some of this. Some maybe have actually retarded a little bit of evolution or
Mhm.
change. And what you're seeing based on your current position, the fact in the department that you're as a leadership position, because that's a big topic right now, law enforcement leadership.
Yeah.
And I here's the thing, man. I don't very rarely. Joey actually might be one guy. There may be a couple other ones where they have said, like, I have great leadership and I feel very supported. And I find that to be obviously very problematic. And it's not that there aren't any other great leaders out there, but I never see publicly being posted, like on an Instagram post or in a YouTube podcast or something like that, where somebody's saying my leadership is awesome and it's great and we are doing great things and we're being innovative and we're changing with the times in a positive way where it works out best for all parties involved, starting with the people that we're sworn to serve and protect, and then moving on down to the officers themselves and the agency is the last thing. Because I really feel like if you're handling the first thing right, the other things get taken care of really well, for the most part. That the irony in that is so many decisions get made under the veil of we're doing this for officer safety or we're doing this for to better our communities, and the reality of it is it doesn't tend to work out that way, and we're doing it this way for whatever reasons, and I'm having such a tough time kind of understanding it, and I don't. This isn't it's not a plea or me getting up on the pulpit, but I have a rough time with this because leadership is not easy, but it's also not complicated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so if we kind of go back through history and just kind of look at things, and going back to this change that I want to talk about, I think what we've seen is like an evolution in society, which obviously bleeds over into the profession that you're in. Um, I think about my dad, who's going to be 84 years old this year. When he was growing up, you went to school. You hoped that you could get to college. He was the first one in his family to get to college and graduate college, and he did that after serving in the military and doing a lot of things as a kid, working a lot of jobs, 2 jobs at a time, while he was going to high school, in junior high. Lost his dad at a young age. Went through a lot of things that a lot of normal people go through, but the pathway was go to school, get an education, set yourself up for a better life, whatever that means, get a job, be the company man for 30, 40 years at a company, retire and live the rest of your life, on your retirement and so forth. And so there was like a commitment to it. And that was kind of the ladder that people would go through. And then over time, that's kind of changed. Not kind of, it's changed dramatically. And to the extent, like, I live in the smack dab of the Silicon Valley. Working for a company here in the Silicon Valley for 3 to 5 years is like an eternity.
Yeah. You're old bones there. Yeah.
People are constantly shifting. It's very incestuous. There's people, they're constantly being pulled away, and there's never. So whether it's a commitment level to something or it's just that things are changing so fast, there's so much more opportunity, that causes a societal shift in terms of making a commitment to something for whatever it is, a certain period of time. And so I see this shift happening where I've talked to, this isn't one person, this is many people, but it really struck me when I heard it the first time, for a very seasoned officer in a leadership role at an agency, who told me, he goes, man, it is different. Like, a lot of the same things we saw 10, 15 years ago in terms of, the recruits and the challenges that they had and, the candidates coming in. They're not all entirely different, but mindset is definitely different. And what he said to me was, if I have 10 guys in a class, I could go up to 5 of them and 5 of them will tell me, if I ask them, why'd you become a cop? A lot of them will say, I thought it would be cool. I wanted to try it for a while and see if I liked it.
Yeah.
So contrast that to like my old man who would have been like, no, I got this job. I worked hard to get it. And I'm in this job and I'm committed to doing it for a certain period of time. Now, he's changed jobs along the way. It was inherently the same job. He changed companies like 3 times as a kid, 3 times over, 40 plus years of working. But that struck me and I was like, whoa, because that's seemingly so much different than a lot of the older officers that I'm friends with that are at the end of their career, 20, 25 years, maybe even longer, that they got into that job because that was what they were in their minds born to do. And they've made lots of mistakes and had lots of successes along the way, but all the time they had this vision of, I am doing this thing. This is who I am. And so there's an identity attached to that was much more about completing the thing versus like, I'm just kind of checking this out. And I say all that to say, before I actually let you have a part in this podcast.
No, you're priming it. This is good.
I say all that to say, what that creates is an entirely different environment for all the generations that have come through. And what we're currently, at least from my perception, what law enforcement is currently dealing with, because you have that dedicated, and I don't want to say the newer officers are not dedicated. That is not what I'm saying. That person that's been in it for so long that came into it with that mindset, and then you have this other end of the spectrum of folks that have come in that are like, they don't have the same mindset. And is that wrong? Is that creating problems? Or is that creating, I assume it's creating new challenges. I wonder what they are. And I wonder what shifts you're seeing that should be happening and what shifts you're not seeing happen that need to happen as you're, again, going back to your days as a recruiter and now your days as an officer, your days as a recruiter, and your time now as a leader in more of an administrative role.
Yeah. So yes, and yes, all of the above. Yeah. Mindset is drastically different. You pointed out a lot of the generational themes outside of law enforcement, just with just the general populace, right? So those are things that we need to be aware of. However, all these things considered, the older generation, the old guard, whatever you call it, like law enforcement is just more traditional in all those rights, right? Like uniform personnel, the first responder, supposed industries are just more traditional. And so we have been more rigid in changing and adapting to those things. And so what you pointed out with new recruits these days, which they're dipping their toe, they're seeing what's up. Is it fun? I don't know. My buddy did it for 5 years. Maybe I'll do it for 2. Maybe I'll pick up a bonus. We could call it a lack of loyalty. We could call it a lack of like values or like strong belief. And maybe there is a lack of defining their why and their purpose, which is so big for me. And I think that we can help them as employers. We can help them help themselves by keeping them out until they're really solidified in that. Like I've been fortunate enough to be able to filter out a lot of people that don't really know what they're doing and why. We were able to get to a point where we're so selective because we put so much effort into recruiting in the most seemingly impossible time to recruit. And we had great success because we were able to build so much cohesion, not just with the recruiting team, but command, the union, the line level, the community. Like it was just like all hands on deck. And that's where we got a lot of our success. So I see why we have this situation where so many agencies across the nation are still struggling. We're 2024, the worst was 19 through 21. Mm-hmm. And we're still suffering the consequences of that, even with a nearly full staff agency with development, with that veteran experience, right? You pointed out people career changing earlier than anticipated. And so that recent episode you heard, 155 on mine, was with my buddy, like one of my closest friends, Trevor. He grew up wanting to be a cop his whole life. And he did 10 years. He's like, no, not for me. Whereas like I came into the idea as an adult and I was like, hey, here we go. Like, but we both had this strong why, but things change. And so one more thing that I'll answer maybe to address part of what you brought up is that there is this difference where there's more free agency. There's more free agency with different industries, but also within the police departments, right? So you see all these signing bonuses. I think the highest one I saw was Alameda down in, your state, your giant state.
Yeah, it's 30 minutes away.
Yeah, and it was like 75 grand. And then a lot of comments were like, oh, I'd never work for Alameda. And, there's a reason why they got to, I don't know, right? I'm not trying to make a commentary about that, but just to say it's not uncommon up here to have 25 grand, 40 grand is the new high up here. What I know is really uncomfortable for a lot of people when they see that. I also think that it's necessary in some ways because going back to what you started saying originally was like, you see this void of people robustly supporting their police leadership saying, no, I work in a department that the bosses really give a dang, right? And so, outside of Joey in this miracle department that we'll never find, it's like a mirage.
He's a unicorn.
Yeah,
Must be a unicorn.
Yeah, you got to go through a wardrobe to get there. But all to say, it incentivizes and necessitates your leadership to step up their game and have an agency that is actually squared away so you can recruit and retain and show value to your people, because your people are your most valuable asset, right? Like, it's not the cars, it's not the tech, it's not any of this, not the cool guns. Those are all a piece of it, but your people, I mean, even for the people that think that sounds fluffy, it's the most expensive. Human life's invaluable, but even for those people that are like, no, show me the numbers, like your training costs, holy cow, like right. To pay someone's salary for like a year and a half before they're actually serviceable in a lot of ways, like it's not complicated, right? We go back to leadership. The tenets are simple: show value to your people, give them purpose and value, and they'll show up for you. But you got to demonstrate it first, right? And that is another generational thing where I would say these younger generations are just more emotionally intelligent, or that we've taught them to be more emotionally intelligent and socially aware, so that they are in tune with these things and they do value them. So whereas we have younger generations, maybe they are going to have higher incidence of therapy and exposure to trauma and trauma therapy, things like that. The older guard might say, "Oh, we never had those problems." Like, no, it's because you didn't talk about them, you didn't recognize them, but but you drink yourself into silliness and shovel it up, under the carpet. So I know I threw a lot of stuff at you and kind of zigzagged, but that's a lot of the things that come to mind when we're talking about some of these trends and challenges.
Yeah. So you mentioned something, I kind of mentioned it too. And that was like, we're seeing early exits for people that are getting out, for me, this is just me from the outside. I have no empirical evidence on any of this, but it looks like that 8 to 15 year police officer is the one we need to be worried about right now. Those are our most veteran cops on the street, our most experienced cops. And when you talk about value, to me, especially when you have a new generation coming in, however we define that, those guys those people, guys and gals, are the the most important, because they're the ones that are on the street with them, showing them the way. And so I wonder the frustrations that they're feeling and shifts that they are seeing that you've already described, right? And they're inherently aware of this. Like they get it. It doesn't mean they're not frustrated by it, or it's that they're at the same time doesn't mean they're accepting of it. What shifts, if any, have you seen anywhere, like in departments where departments or agencies or just the profession as a whole, maybe we just keep it that way, is adjusting to that and trying to help those folks maybe understand or navigate the newer situation for them, because they've been in for, again, 8 to 15 years. Is there anything happening there? And if there is, what is it? Are there successes, or is this just something that is just so new it hasn't been figured out yet and it's still ambiguous?
Yeah, I know a big trend is, that experience void, right? That vacuum out when people, attrited, right? People left with, let's say, anywhere from 2 to 20 years, right? Whereas they would have planned to go much farther. And that's continuing in some regard, right? But a lot of the people that left in those critical years, 2020, 2021, if they were a few years in, if they were really new, they didn't really know any different, and they were kind of sticking with it, you didn't have a lot of really, really new people leave. What you did have is people with a handful of years, but not tenure, right? So they had they had experience. They were your field trainers. They were your up and coming leaders. They were your prospective sergeants to be, maybe the officer in charge, the corporal, someone that would be the go-to resource. And now, a handful of years later, those are the people that shoulda, woulda, coulda been the sergeants, like the people that you think about. Every department has them, right? Where you think about it and you talk about, where would we be if X, Y, and Z people stayed? Oh, that person would be a sergeant. I bet that person would be the senior, the expert detective in this tech, whatever have you, right? Now, with that, I'm not saying that we haven't carried on. For sure we do, because we have, by virtue of the job, self-selection, you have these really hard-charging people that come up and they step up.
Mhm.
And I would take aptitude and attitude over experience and tenure, because that's what's more constructive and that's what's going to get you across the finish line. But did it hurt? For sure. Like, did it create a lot of gaps? For sure. And with your sergeants, like, hats off to the first line supervisors out there, because they're running around ragged with just new people. And there's nothing wrong with the new people. It's just a lot to learn. And I think back, and it's nice to sit down with a couple people, maybe a varying time on, but when I started, and I'll reach across and kind of engage someone in the room that started close to me. I was like, hey, remember how effed up we were? Remember how all the questions we had for Sarge and our FTOs when we were like the 1 to 2 year officers, like we were blowing up the phone all the time because everything was new. It just is. The learning curve is crazy in this job. And yet it is more complicated. It's more litigious. There's more liabilities. There's more contingencies that we're expecting of our officers at every level and our supervisors. That, going back to an earlier question, what are we doing for those people? The good agencies are continuing to develop and show value. The agencies that are running around ragged, and I'm not trying to blame them, it's just we're so reactive. That's almost 99% of what police do, is just react to things, crime trends, what have you. Is that we're just ignoring them because we're busy with other things, but then they feel devalued. They look at other things, or they get comfortable. They should think about promoting, but they're better off staying in their lane or going to detectives and honing their craft. They see value in that, but they don't want to take on these extra liabilities, if you want to put it that way, with this really underexperienced crew that is more stressful for sure in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, so you have this potential leadership that is now exiting or doesn't want the job. And so I wonder, kind of just foreshadowing, or if you can tell the future at all, what your predictions are with this. How long does this take to cycle through? And what is the outcome of this look like in the next 3 to 5 and 5 to 10 and maybe 10 to 15 years? I mean, is anybody talking about this, or is everybody just fearful and worried and upset and bitter and all that?
More the latter, and it is at every stage. And I even have to try to check my own biases and I guess thought patterns, because we get so cynical in the job, partly due to emotional survival, right? Like it's just so rough out there that you don't want to think about all the time, but we're so wired to think of worst case scenario. How is this call going to go the worst ways? So I'm prepared to do it. And then when it doesn't, you're like, okay, like next one, right? But that's what makes us effective. So when there's change, when there's mounting pressures, it's hard, right? Ultimately, where does that leave us? I think with all the generational things we've tracked, I don't know where it leads us, but what I suspect is that we are in an industry and a time where people are going to move on to something quicker. And so my way of highlighting that is, like, if we continue to invest in our people and develop them and show them that we really care for as long as we be there, that as long as they want to be there, that's my adage. That's what I try to tell my people, which is that our role as supervision and leadership in the organization is providing things like development and wellness and support, so that you are armed to do this job for as long as you so choose to do it. Like, as long as you so choose to do it, hats off to you. Hope you do it here. But if you don't, like, good on you. Like, thank you for your time here. We value you. Please go do other things. Go into the private sector, go cure cancer, do whatever you need to do. Thank you for your time. And I think that that's hard, because it might sound counterproductive when people are thinking you're going to help somebody develop themselves so they can leave. And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Because what do I want to do? What do we gain by keeping someone here? And I know of a lot of those conversations, especially in the last few years, where we tolerate some of this really corrosive behavior, and we might even promote it. Like literally, we might promote the corrosive
I think it's
behavior.
very true. I think it's very true.
The other piece of that, right? You have young leadership, or you have the tenured, unsuitable, less suitable leadership where someone got by because they played it safe. They didn't do a whole lot, but they didn't cause a lot of problems, or they're actually negative and quite vocal, but influential in all the wrong ways. And they're given the mic, they're given the pulpit, right? And that's a disaster for culture. That's gonna create these long-term effects that are really hard to recover from.
So you mentioned the word value and providing value. And so one of the things I've been struggling with is trying to understand what that actually is. What does an officer really value? What does an agency really value? What does a city really value in their officers and their agency? And I'm having a tough time coming up with answers, because to me, I think there's some things that are very quantifiable from a qualitative perspective. And so I think there's some subjective and objective things, but I think in order to be able to manage something, you have to be able to measure it. And I'm having a really tough time trying to understand what those things are. So when you say provide value to the officers, particularly, and this could be across the board. Let's take the generational stuff out for a second. What is it that they value? What is it that they need or want to make them feel like they are more valued? And what is it that an agency is measuring to calculate like what we're providing is actually that thing? It's a kind of an open question, and it's a little ambiguous, and I guess that's what my challenge is with it.
Yeah, that is really hard. It's different for everyone, but I'll say that it all comes together. Like, how does someone, I guess when it's show value, and I don't want to use the same word, but worth, like how does an officer feel like they're worth anything? And that's a mixture of things, like literally, how much are you paying me? And then what support are you giving me, right? So that's financial support. So I'm trading my time for dollars, like the simple economics of any job, but then purpose, right? Because if I'm going to risk X, Y, and Z, it has to be for something significant, right? If I know,
bigger,
yes, exactly. And so that's what brought so many people in and continues to bring people in. They know the risks, they know the scrutiny more than ever for people that sign up for this job. Thank you. But I like to remind people too that when I signed up and for years prior, like no one was saying like, I love the police. I guess maybe that's the West Coast thing, like, Seattle area. I'm Seattle adjacent, like your area. Like, sure, I know the majority of people think it's asinine to abolish the police. They're like, yeah, that cool, cute idea. We need them to survive as a society. But
we learned that in spades, haven't we?
Yeah, but some of us, most of us knew, and most of us still know. But neither here nor there. But ultimately, like, how do you show that support? And then it's not really measurable unless you survey it and measure it. And what agency wants to get that data? I mean, some good ones, actually, I do know that, right? I know that some agencies do put out polls, wellness driven, or maybe they have an outside company come in and consult and say, like, how are we doing? And that's a really scary thing. Like, if you feel uncomfortable with that question, that means that you're asking a really good question. And if you're willing to peel that wallpaper, that means you're probably a really good leader. If you're like, yeah, let's keep it right there. It's not like have the sky fall. But I totally get it. It's scary to ask these questions because you're going to get some answers you might not like.
Yeah, I think, that's the point of this conversation. Really, is just, I think it all starts, the problem solving and the solution finding starts with the conversation. And what I kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation and developing that why, or that really well-developed why, I think that puts you in a much better position to ask the right kinds of questions as an officer if you're taking personal responsibility for those things. But if you're coming in with a really underdeveloped why, you don't even know what questions to ask. And you certainly, if you don't know what questions to ask, then you probably haven't fully identified what it is that's valuable to you. And the whole idea of service, and I'm here to serve, that is a reason, that is a thing that you can latch onto, but it goes deeper than that. And again, going back to the younger, maybe the younger generation, I think one of the things I struggle with is things are so, I guess the achievement. It's achievement, achievement, achievement all the time. And to the extent that we hand out participation trophies for merely showing up, and sometimes you get one for not even doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And I that's not to come across as being negative. It's just that's just kind of what we live in. It's easier to feel that sense of achievement and acceptance in so many different ways now versus before. And there's no stick on the end of that. Like, well, what happens when you don't? What does that mean? What does that feel like? And what does that drive in terms of a decision-making process or a reevaluation process of what could I be doing better? And so I think what that kind of turns into is kind of waiting around to be told what to do. And I think you didn't say that, but I kind of hear that in maybe the frustration when you're looking at these more veteran officers having to do that more than they've ever had to do and finding frustration in that. I wonder if I'm right about that.
With veteran officers feeling, yeah, can you?
So sorry, to sort of be more specific with the question. You have a younger officer who has less life experience, has less of a developed why and a purpose for being there in doing the job. And, they got into it because it looked cool. They wanted to wear their uniform. And it maybe came from less of, my dad was a cop. My grandfather was a cop. His dad, my uncles were cops. I know about this job. I know the good stuff. I know the bad stuff. And despite all of the things, this is what I was born to do versus somebody, or this is what I'm committed to doing. I get it. And obviously there's learning experiences along the way versus nobody's ever been a cop in my family before. Like I'm here to kind of find out what this is all about. This is more of a discovery process for that younger officer, maybe than it is for the more senior officer who came in with a little bit more development, coming in. And again, that's not to disparage a younger generation. I just think that's what they're faced with. So having said that, those older officers, when I say older, I just mean more veteran, having to deal with a cop like that, right? In a situation like on the street multiple times over and over and over again, and having to walk them through these processes, I wonder how that impacts them.
Yeah, it's just burnout. It's just a lot of work, right? And I'll curb the first part, at least my perception of it. I don't think that most people coming in have a lack of purpose. I think a lot of people saw, in my experience in my region, a lot of people saw what was going on in 2020, 2021, and they're like, F that, I'm going to do something, right? Like maybe I know a handful of people that they put it on pause, maybe their career progression coming in. They had intended to be a cop. Then family's like, what are you thinking? And they hit the pause button, but then they push through. Or you have a lot of people these days that are like, they're in social work or they're teachers or they're in corporate and they're like, no, this isn't the thing. And they see the need, right? So that goes back to that purpose. So they're coming in for a lot of good reasons. When I feel less assured of that is when I look at nationally, when they're lowering or removing fitness standards. And our episode is going to drop next week on that with Chris Curris on Blue Grit.
Oh,
but
right.
Yeah, the issues therein, right? Which is I don't want to go down that tangent too far. But yeah, going back to the experienced people that stuck around, they're burned out, right? They've ridden that wave, and I want to feel for us and them, but at the same time, what I want to circle around going on mindset and purpose is like, okay, cool. 2020, that sucked. 2021, that sucked. Okay, the last few years you were like understaffed and burned out. And yeah, that sucked too. And I was doing 2 jobs. That sucked. Okay, cool. When are we going to stop talking about what sucked and we have an opportunity to start building traction and not adopt the victim mentality? Because where does that leave us? And even when we talk about bosses, they don't get it, or the sergeants are on a different planet and all these things. Like and I'm not trying to sound fluffy, but like if we want to stay constructive, let's take a step back. And most of us come in with this really good intent, and most of us are pretty good dudes and gals, but we're not speaking the same language. We're not listening. We're not showing up. We're not actually asking the questions. Going back to the earlier thing where I want cops everywhere just to recognize, hey, it's hard enough. Let's stop the infighting. And that's admin versus the line. That's union versus the sergeants, and detectives versus patrol. Like we all have a hard enough job to do when we're fighting criminals, like anything ranging from people making some terrible choices and some people that are actually vile and destructive, corrosive evil to our most vulnerable people. Like, what is our core purpose? Is to protect the vulnerable. That's not infight, right? Let's step out of that because we have enough to deal with.
Yeah. So I think that is the struggle that people are having, right? I mean, at the end of the day is they have that purpose. They feel like they're running into roadblocks and they're seeing it like from their own people. And organizationally that's very tough. And I think from the institution in and of itself, it's going through these transition phases right now. And you nailed it. And that's where I wanted to get to on this is like, okay, 2020, 2021, that was ugly and it sucked. And as a citizen, I watched it happen right in front of me. I just saw the look of defeat on so many of my friends' faces or the officers that I was dealing with just in my own neighborhood on for things that we had to call, like, and they would show up and it was a different type of, when I say that, it was a different approach to things. There was less energy, or let's just say it was a different kind of energy. And so I saw all that. And so I can't imagine what it was like actually having to be the guy in the uniform or the person in the uniform dealing with it. But you're right. At some point, you got to let it go. And you have to decide, why am I here? Or refresh your brain and your heart, I guess, and your soul. And why am I here? And what am I actually trying to get done? And I think I want to believe most officers that they're doing their best to do that. But along the way, they've developed a certain identity of who they are as a cop and what they're there to do and how they're supposed to do it. And they've invested so much into it. And they're reaching this point where they're kind of having an identity crisis. Like, did I make a wrong decision? Am I in the wrong place right now? And so we're watching them walk away from the profession, and because they may have not been left with much else to think about. Partly that's part of self. And then part of that is like, what is the department doing to give them roads or pathways, the agency, the profession, pathways to find a different way to do the same kind or similar work. And so I wonder, again, going back to shifts, are you seeing any shifting happening, maybe even at your own agency, where that is starting to happen, or where we're seeing people maybe being encouraged to do things that they had never thought about doing and being given opportunities to do them?
Yeah, for sure. That's the development piece. So one of my thought patterns and like one of the things I'm working on at work in my duties and then also in Blue Grid is like, okay, development. Like, that's the theme. What do we need? It's always development. And that's really the point of Blue Grid, right? It's not like I know better, but that's why I bring people like you, folks yourself, like experts, to come in and we keep working on this thing. Like, how do we get better in every aspect of our lives? How do we show up the best for work, for purpose, for family, all the things, just life purpose? Like, how do you optimize yourself? And that comes with all these things, mindset, routine. And so how do we show up and show value to our people? Well, we invest in them. We give time. And so it is sitting down with my sergeants, and I'm very fortunate to have some badass sergeants, right? That we can sit down, we can talk over these issues and build alignment to say, hey, I don't know better than you. I know different than you. Like, my job in the organization is a different seat. Your job is a different seat. I love your job and I see how influential it is. Let me know how I can help you. Here's an idea I have. Pick it apart. Let's craft this into a better idea. How does that look for us to develop our people? How can we mobilize that? And so maybe it becomes, yeah, let's start by sitting down with our people every month. And so that's something we're refining, pitching some questions around, add those, remove those, and making sure that it hones in on things like, how can we show up for you? Like, what do you need from me? Right? These are the things that the old school people would probably roll their eyes at. Like, oh, I'm gonna ask how to show up as a leader. Like, excuse me? But that's like, yeah, you don't need to ask how to be a boss. Just be a boss. Just tell people what to do, right? Like, that's being a manager, whatever. But to be a leader, really the crux of ideal leadership, and I'm trying to figure out, that's like my quest, right? Continue refining that in a way that I can for me, because I'm a different person than this person or this commander. But leadership is having people follow you because they want to, not because they have to. And so if you meet them halfway, say, hey, what can I be doing differently? How do you prefer your feedback? How are these conversations going? Are you annoyed, right? Like, at least if nothing else, people see you're trying. and think about that for yourself. Like, think about the good, bad, middle bosses, apathetic, engaged. You're like, I think most of us would agree that the ones that were trying, you'd give more grace and you'd be more willing to do something for them, right? So really, that's the crux of it. It's like just intention, attention, all these things, and I don't think there's a secret sauce. I think you just got to start rolling with it and be open to critique and keep building it.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned something obviously at the beginning, like there's compensation and then there's the job that you do, and is it worth it, in the end? I think there's so much value in what you said there in terms of giving up people autonomy in having a voice. And I think that more than ever, especially when you're looking at the world of social media and how it's evolved, that so many people seem to have a voice. And I think officers or law enforcement in general, those that are on the street are doing the job and faced with the things that you mentioned and the types of people that you mentioned on a daily basis, feel like they don't have one, and somebody else has got it for them. And that would be a real challenge for me. One of the things that I always valued when I ever worked for somebody else and ultimately worked for myself was, and that I wanted to provide for my people, was I want to make sure that, number one, they have the support and the resources they need in order to be able to do the job that I'm asking them to do. Right.
Yep.
That's critical. And those are very specific things. And I have a question about that for you. But the other thing is I wanted them to have the autonomy with those things to do the right thing and know how to do the right thing when the time came up. And I feel like maybe there was a time, again, going back to pre-2021, where maybe law enforcement felt like they had more of that. And now they feel like they have less because of legislation or department policies or all the things that are kind of happening. And then it got taken away. It was, or they were being asked to do things that was, morally and ethically against everything they believed in and why they signed up for the job. And now, and during that same time, other people had so much more of a voice. There was so much more noise. And a lot of it comes from the public. Or from those very caustic, toxic voices that you mentioned, that have since left the profession, or in some cases still in the profession, that aren't making the situation better. And yet these folks are still left in this situation where, like, look, I'm doing the best I can, but you guys are making this really, really hard. And so part of the problem, I think, is not giving people a voice. I mean, I've had numerous podcasts set up with officers to talk about things. These are stand-up professional leaders within their own right and within their own agencies, and given approval by some level of leadership, only to have it snuffed out by some other level of leadership. And so there's this disconnect between the public and what they're saying and the officers and what they're doing and what they want to say, and they're being stifled.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest complaints I hear is that, from officers, is like, the public doesn't understand what we do. And they're right. I think they're absolutely right about that. And part of it is because not so much that officers are being told to keep their mouth shut. They don't need to be told that, because they're seeing the consequence of what happens if they maybe speak up or whatever. So going back to have the autonomy to be able to talk about it, at least internally, I think maybe relieves the valve a little bit there on that. But I wonder, as you're, again, obviously you've got a very successful podcast that reaches a huge audience. And I wonder if there's words of advice to people in terms of that want to have more of a voice, that are looking to put it out there in some way, what advice you would have in doing that, both internally and externally. What are the things they could be saying, should be saying, and how do they do it?
Yeah, that's good. One thing before I forget is you said something about making sure you give your people the things they need, the mechanisms they need to do the job that you want them to do and they want to do. And that's almost verbatim what my deputy chief says, right? He's like, and when we talk about wellness, and you might cause some pause there, right? Because I'm the wellness guy at work. It's like, hey, we need to give our people time to work out. We need to support these things, have programs to make ourselves these athletes and be able to respond effectively to what may come, and then decompress and address the mental and emotional health and the stress and trauma. But I love how he he built that into how he looks at wellness. He's like, well, is that not being well organizationally and people coming to do a job? You're spending 40 to 60 hours doing this thing you ideally want to do. Are we giving you what you need? And that goes back to purpose. Like, are you happy, healthy, fulfilled? If you feel supported, like you have the tools, you have the law. And that's what a lot of people felt like they were challenged with, right? In different regions, especially ours. And then do you have the support? Like, okay, go do the job we charge you to do. You have a gun and a badge in the law. What about your admin? Are they supporting you? If you go do that thing and it turns out ugly, right? And so that's what a lot of officers have some pause and some reservations at best. And going into fear, right? So why don't officers have the mic? Why are they not allowed to say something? It's fear, right? Like it's safer if you say nothing. Like for an administration, for an organization, absolutely. But at the same time, we trust you to carry a gun and a badge. I'm a commander. I'm not there. I'm not like live streaming to them interacting. And when they're interviewing, I'm like, oh, probable cause, go get them. Like I look at it all like way after the fact. I got to trust my people. And I do, because we have good training. We have good people. We suss it out. We have a great recruiting background process. So I need to release control and trust. And that goes back to support, right? So like, how do you build trust? You model it, you give it. But the reason why I'm going so much in the weeds of the different parts of your question and prompt is because I think that they're all interrelated, right? So if someone doesn't have agency, they don't have autonomy, they don't have a voice, what do? I mean, again, maybe more to the leadership if you're not allowing people to speak out, and not like on some pulpit, but just be real with people. And that's what I try to do here or on my platform. That's where I feel very fortunate to have a supportive leadership that lets me do that. Like I don't have to hide my agency or anything. It's not hidden on my page. But all to say that I started when I was nervous about it, but I was trying to do recruiting, and that was like the real reason why I started coming out on podcasts and starting my own. Was it was a vehicle to talk about real policing and what we're looking for and how to get people more engaged. And really is efficiency, right? I could talk about my agency and recruiting for 40 minutes, an hour, and just send links, right? I didn't have to have a conversation.
Right.
It's
smart.
I could do it at scale, and then I could follow up and then hear really what they wanted to know and meet them. But anywho, where do you start? I mean, you picture that for agencies, do you give people an opportunity to talk at committee meetings? Cool. Do they go off the rails? Do they say some rogue stuff? No? Okay. Give them some trust. They've earned it. Trust them, right? And so for officers, for people at the line level or whatnot that are trying to engage more, think about the mechanisms that you do have. Where are you allowed to speak? Community meetings? Cool. Get more involved with your community. Show up, right? Community policing. It's fantastic. And even if it's not an event, shout out to BC Sanders. Like community policing is getting out of your car and talking to people, right? You'll know what's going on. They'll see that you're there for them. You're just talking, you're learning what the problem is so you can go help fix that problem. Like it's empowering, right? That's as good or better than a 911 call because people are telling you about the trends that you could look out for and you can articulate that, right? So that's training and legal knowledge to incorporate it with your response. But then otherwise, like consider an anonymity, right? There's a lot of people that we know that just choose to for officer safety or because of their role or because of their department regulations. Like, cool, they blog and they do it under pseudonym, right? They use a nickname or they use a pen name and they have a podcast, they have a page, they want to put out this constructive content or critical content, right? That there's value in that too. Like this is the USA, like we need differing opinions so we can
100%.
Challenge ourselves. And I think that that's a lot of what you're getting at, especially with officers being tasked with doing immoral things. I'm so fortunate I didn't have to make that choice. And I know so many of my department, we were in the same boat, kind of watching what was happening around the nation. Like, what are we going to do during this crazy time? If we have to be forced with that, like, am I going to do that thing or I'm going to quit? And so many people are like, I think I'm going to quit. Cool. Like that agency, let's take notes of who's not doing that thing. Regardless, I only bring it up because it is something that we should keep in mind. Like we need to learn from history and just make sure that that's part of our why. Like we need to know why we're doing this, and it's to protect the vulnerable from really bad things and really bad people and show up for them.
So you mentioned something there just about equipping people with the tools to actually be able to do the job. And again, going back to the shifting, this exiting of so many more experienced people, and I've heard this said before, like the stats change every time, but it's like there's 100 jobs and 10 people applying for them, versus before it was 100 people applying for 4 jobs. And so there's obviously a recruitment process that goes on there, and then there's a filling the candidates. You've got to put butts in the seats, and with that, there's varying skill levels and there's various commitment levels, and we've kind of touched on all that stuff. But I just wonder, just in your mind, like, what are the tools, right? And aside from, and I'm talking about practical skills, right, that show up on the street or show up in incidents, whether it's that getting out of the car and that community policing, to all the other things that can happen in terms of use of force. Is the institution of law enforcement right now really providing the tools in the way that it needs to be in order to provide them, these cops, the things they need to do to actually do the physical job out there on the street? And what are those? Because that's something, like, when I look at like what we're valuing, again, as a society in our police department, what we want is them to show up on our worst day and solve our problem, right? Whatever that happens to be.
Mhm.
And that can be a lot of things. And unfortunately, those things are not necessarily well understood by the public. And I don't mean just understanding the law. I mean, when it's time to enforce the law enforcement, and the word force is inside of that,
Mhm.
this is a more pointed question. Are we giving our law enforcement officers the tools and the training they need to actually do that thing? Or are we setting them up for failure? So again, very pointed question.
Yeah,
Give me your thoughts.
as a baseline, nationally, state standards, absolutely not. Are we making sure that everyone that comes in the door has the tenacity, the drive, the wherewithal, and the self determination as a baseline, right? Like, that's why it's called blue grit. Like, that is the one controllable thing you have, is your attitude and how hard you work. Do we even have that like baseline?
As a baseline.
Yeah,
Yep.
I would say no. And then beyond that, fitness. Like, we are both such advocates for fitness, but that's not just fit to be fit. Yes, you literally have to. You might have to overpower someone bigger than you, high on who knows what. Like, that's a tangible necessity of the job for law enforcement. Like, hey, guess what? A lot of people don't want to go to jail. Weird.
Right.
And then ultimately, can you do it? And can you do it in a way that's not reckless? Right. I recently heard somebody that is no longer employed. They were recruited at a nearby agency that literally said to other recruits, "Well, I'm so small, like, I'm not really paying attention to this DT stuff. If someone really tries to overpower me, like, I'm just gonna shoot them." We're like, "Ooh, that's not it.
Wow.
That's not the stuff, right? That's not what the public or cops, and no one wants that." So ultimately, like, are we giving them, making sure that they have the tools, fitness, which is also, again, not just for fitness, but stress management, critical thinking during stress, and whether you take to the mats or whether you do intervals, all this stuff. Like, can your brain operate when you're limiting your oxygen supply and you're building up lactic acid against it? It goes back to grit and just that ability to overcome adversity. Are we sussing that out? Individual agencies, perhaps, and then individual agencies are working on those things, but as like a baseline, absolutely not.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up. Obviously, that's an obvious one to me. The fitness aspect, which plays into so many other things,
Is everything.
Going back
Yeah.
to confidence, presence, your ability to handle stressful situations, doing hard things prepares you to do other hard things. Yeah. Obviously, we've had deeper conversations about this with other people as well. You mentioned that podcast that's coming up, and kind of some thoughts I shared my thoughts there, from the outside looking in. But this is something that's measurable, and it's something that you could hold people accountable to. You could also reward people for,
Yeah.
right? For
Yeah.
doing a good job with. And at some level, there has to be a little bit of the carrot and the stick. And going back to sort of how you see it being implemented. Yes, there are agencies, I've been involved with some, that have done a really good job with this and are trying to do the best they can, given the resources that they have or don't have, for that matter, to get it done. But what I end up seeing is there are teams, whether it's SWAT or some other, special operations unit, that end up setting their own standards within their team, which is ultimately inside their agency, that could be influential. Yet, going back to all the things we've talked about, it ends up being very isolated, and it's kind of like the club within the club, and there's a certain group of people or percentage of people, and it's pretty small, right? That are really taking that very, very seriously, and making sure that the other people that they're surrounded by take that very, very seriously. And they didn't need somebody to come down and tell them to do it. And that's the shift that I struggle with, is that why can't that be more of a, why can't it be quantified, right? And again, we talked a little bit about this, but why can't it be quantified? And why isn't an agency or the institution valuing that at a much higher level? And because of all the things you just said, like if you don't have that baseline, right, of that, then what do you have? Then it goes straight to, like, this officer you're talking about, goes, well, I'll just go straight to the tools. Well, that brings up a whole other question, right? Do they have the training with those tools? And
probably not, honestly.
Probably
right?
not.
With that kind of mentality, right?
Right. And then again, with those tools, have we just put tools in place of fitness? And you mentioned things like grappling, right? With hands-on DT type of training. If we talk about combatives or combat sports and the things that you can learn from that, like, if you don't have the ability to go hands-on, and now you're just saying, well, here's a tool to solve the problem that you can't handle hands-on, to me, that is problematic. What you've just done is you've created a disaster in the waiting. And unfortunately, we're seeing that kind of again, when I go back to what the public will show you or what they will talk about, it's those things that we see. And so again, the training aspect, and are we equipping people? That is one thing. And obviously, we just moved into the tools perspective. There's the shooting piece. We talked about the grappling or the hands-on piece. Are there any other, like, measurable tools that we could have, like a carrot and a stick kind of thing here going on, where we could be measuring it? Because look, man, like, you had to be in shape at one point to get through the academy, and then you're never asked to do that again. And so on the, I guess, without, I'm getting on a little bit of a tangent here. Are there other skills that need to be improved in your mind, that are measurable skills that seem to be the most pertinent for those officers that are on the street doing the job, that are or not being trained to the level that they need to be trained in order to get the job done?
Yeah, I might distance some people, but I would go to EQ and empathy, adaptability, right? Like, these things that you toggle on and off, and, like, we can't be light switches. We can't,
You're
it's
not
not
robots.
just not all hit and miss. Like, some of the best cops are super squared away. Joey, like, we brought him up earlier, right? But he's got a heart, and you got to have a heart to serve. And that's one thing my chief says. And I fully agree, right? And I will say, like, I'm not trying to sound like that guy, especially that admin, but, like, no, I've been the cop that was closed off and purposefully unempathetic. And was I, like, what did I have a meter? No, I didn't need a meter. I can look back and be like, I was a D word, right? And I was a D word to people on the street, quote unquote. I was a D word to other people in the department. I was a D word to my friends and family, because I was not taking care of myself, right? I was not focusing on these things, and I was focusing on all the wrong parts that I was exposed to in police culture when I was pretty new, right? So I look back and I'm like, well, I wasn't really effective in my life or my career in the ways that I can be. And I learned later, by having patience, by talking to people like they're people, not like they're all criminals just because I stopped them on a stop, right? Like, that's ultimately, you're fulfilling all these stereotypes when you do that. And so if we just give some patience with safety in mind, right? Be prepared for anything, but don't expect it's going to, don't act like it's happening. And the difference, like, I talked to Seb Laval on my show, is he's like, yeah, he's a tactical dude, very experienced RCMP dude, but he's like, yeah, if we expect the worst every moment, then when you roll up to the house, you're actually not rolling up to the house. You're like, we're calling in the armor. We're pulling out our AR. We're walking up to this house. We don't really know what's going on, but we're ready for an ambush any second. Like, that's the extreme. Or you walk up tactically, you mind your corners, you mind your fatal funnels, and you have a plan if things start to unfold with clues that you get, right? So there's a difference. It's more nuanced. So it's not expecting catastrophe, which you see some people that are jumpy and they're maladapted to the stresses, and maybe they're not. Maybe there are things like stress inoculation that they could use, or fitness, or just better mindset, de-escalating themselves, breathing, like all these things that are very tangible. But I'll just say, like, it is all absolutely interconnected. And that's where I nerd out talking about all this stuff. So how can we be better cops? We got to hit all these prongs.
Yeah, which is the challenge, and which is why I wanted to talk to you, because again, it's really about having the conversation and bringing awareness to it, and trying to maybe get out of, it's interesting you mentioned that. I'll be honest, my best friends that have been police officers for a long time can all describe themselves as being that guy that you described yourself as, maybe early on at some point in their career, and recognized how destructive it was for them, and where they found, they had to re-identify with who they were, what they were doing, and why they were doing it, because they recognized that the job had just consumed them. And it was the things that they were faced with on a daily basis that they were already expecting, and already built it up in their mind that this is what it was going to be. Now, there's some level of survivability that comes along with that.
Yeah.
Like that hypervigilance, the being ready for anything at any time. That is part of being a police officer, in my mind. That's everybody should have a little bit of that in them. And I recognize not everybody does, which is why we have police officers, right? Because those are the calls that they're going to be called to a good amount of the time. I guess my point in saying all that is this: at some point, it seems to me the best officers all reach that point, and it seems to me that so many more are reaching that point so much earlier, or maybe stuck and kind of languishing in that after, kind of the things they've experienced and seen over the last couple of years. And so going back to equipping people, I heard you say that, like, you may, what was the term? I can't remember the term you used there, but that it might be off-putting. That wasn't what you said, but you might lose some people or whatever it was, about thinking about these things. To me, that's really important. Having, you mentioned EQ, and being able to check in and understand where you are, and recognize how you can change just through that piece, that mindset piece, and understanding how you're showing up.
Yeah. And the reason why I said that is, like, we had mandatory EQ come in for the whole city, and I knew how I heard it, right? It's the hallways, the cops are groaning, oh, this and that. And yeah, a lot of the exercises weren't like really cop specific, like, cop culturally competent, but the points were all valid. And ultimately it's like, okay, EQ, if it feels fluffy and woo, like, really it's just like self acknowledgement, like recognizing your own feelings. Is that not powerful? And so there's some of the most tactical, proficient, I guess, operational officers, right? The most optimized officers, that they are very aware of their emotions. And so they're not making brash decisions. They start getting out, someone's under their skin. They're like, hey, buddy, you go talk to him. And they switch out. Like, there's a whole like program, like, dubbed basically to like tap out your buddy so they don't do something stupid or say something stupid. Like, cool. That's like just literally looking out, just being aware of your emotions, and swapping that, right? Like, that's just great common sense. But we get so opposed to some of these ideas because they've been branded certain ways. But no, let's just think about the raw information and what is it going with. And it just really goes back to all these things that you point out through the whole conversation: politics, the scrutiny, this and that, and whatever. Okay, cool. Like, what can you control? Can you control what your commander says and how he says it? No. But you can do the best you can to show up the best you can for your buddies, for the community, and for your family when you go home, for your buddies when you're on the day off. So you're not freaking out about everything that's bugging you and just venting about work. Like, no, like, there's a healthy management system, and that's through healthy practices that is going to look different for everyone. But yeah, I mean, you talked about identity, and I think that, my buddy Trevor, on that recent episode you heard, like, we're talking after the recording since it just aired, and we're talking about it where I feel like so many of us, we go full bore in. And then now when we come back out and you hear all these veterans coaching the younger guys, myself included for a long time, it's like, hey man, like, don't make this your whole life. Like, go spend time off, like, don't work overtime and all that. But
it's easier said than done, I'm sure.
Easier said than done. And if you think about, like, all the best cops, like, went full bore, like, we jumped to the deep end. And
It's the cop I want.
that's how you get better, right? And
Right.
so I think that the answer is actually like for the new people, and shout out to Sam Steiner, one of the guys I work with that's been on my show a couple times, but he says that advice, which is very contrary to a lot of people that are trying to come in the job. He's like, no, nerd out. Like you're so impassioned, like you're so passionate about all this stuff. Like learn everything you can, be a sponge, work all the overtime, volunteer for all the details. Now, don't keep that pace, toggle it back, because when you go into the deep end, you get uncomfortable, you make mistakes. That's where you learn. Mm-hmm. Now start building in all these other things. And, you know, he's another example. He's shared about that kind of thing too. Like he's a great cop. And in his, I suppose, life maturity, and hopefully he doesn't mind me talking about him, but in his life maturity and kind of just figuring out like that right balance, he's done that. I'm doing that, right? Like, so I started as a cop. I was not married. I did not have a kid. And so what better time to go full bore and develop all these unhealthy life work balance things, right? But then refine it and build in better structure and boundaries and expectations of myself now that I'm continuing on. Like that's going to help, you know, those key people you're talking about, the 8 to 15 year people. That's what's going to help you not redline and burn out in one more year. If you want to go 20 to 30, cool. Like power down and do stuff that's not cop stuff. Hang out with friends that aren't cops. That's going to help you. It's actually going to help you be a better cop, which feels and sounds counterintuitive, but it's absolutely true.
Yeah. That's the kind of conversation I wanted to have right there, because everything you just mentioned and most of what we've talked about, not all, but most of what we talked about is not a leadership thing. This is not something that should be coming extrinsically from anybody else. This is personal responsibility that you have to take for yourself, which means you have to be introspective. You have to look in. You have to take a step back, throttle back, know how to do that, find outlets, go to the fucking gym. I'll say it, right? Like burn off that steam, get fit, down regulate, you know, emotionally, physically, psychologically, find things to do. If you're that type of person that, you know, that always wants to go, find something where you can do that maybe also helps you with your skills. Go compete, you know, go to USPSA, go to PCSL, or go to the MMA gym, or go to BJJ, or, you know, I don't know, paint, do some art, play
pottery,
music.
Yeah, exactly. Dude, all that stuff. And that's where I love it. Like it is leadership, but yeah, I think what you're saying, you're not looking to someone else. Like don't outsource your leadership. Like it comes from within. Like leadership starts with ownership. Like lead yourself in your life, and then you can lead your family. Like as a dad, I on my social media, a lot of it's like, okay, #dad life, but that's how I can show up the best. If I can take care of myself and run my life with conviction and take care of all these balancing competing energies and efforts, then I know I can show up better for my daughter. I know I'm setting the right tone. I know I'm showing up for my wife. And then the circles expand from there, right? And ultimately, like that's my healthier balance. Is people ask how long I'm going to do this job, what I want to do. Like, we'll see. I have some ideas. I have some other ideas. And I'm not going to compensate for all the unknowns. But one thing I do know at the end of the day is like, I'm not going to deprioritize my wife, my kid. And even when we talk about being that guy, like your buddies have been that guy, I've been that guy, you build in boundaries and guardrails. And so that's me having proactively, or I suppose reactive, cops are always reactive, right? Because that happened, my closest friends know that they need to call me out, and I've already invited it, right? So if at any point someone's like, dude, you're going back there, I need to check myself, be like, oh, I've warned myself. I've warned my buddies about future me, and here I am. Then I need to do some reevaluation about, is the job serving me and my life?
Right.
You know, and so like we need to know our priorities. We need to know like our life mission, or else we're just kind of going through the motions and like for what?
Yeah. So in sort of wrapping this up, I guess I would say this about what you said, and that is you are your own leader. And so if you're letting the tail wag the dog, and you can't do that you can't be the leader for yourself, I think you better check yourself before you're complaining about or pointing the finger at other quote unquote leaders that maybe have a title or, you know, specific things on their collar or their shirt sleeves or whatever else. Like I think that's a really great point to kind of end on that, because I think it's easily lost. And I get how it happens, man. I have been there. I've in the things that I've done. And ultimately I had to come out the other side and go, well, A lot of how much of that was on me, at the end, how much of what was in my control did I let get out of control? And at the same time, like going back to the training and the fitness and all of those things, I shouldn't expect somebody else to tell me what to do and how to do that. Like that, those are things, those are again, going back to baseline things. Those are things you got to control on your own. I appreciate that statement a ton, and it's something that I'll think about a little bit more, and probably something I need to check in with myself on a couple of things, even just in my own life and the things that I do.
That's
So,
good,
last
man.
question. I'll let you go. I've kept you long enough, man. But I'm
You're good.
excited to hear and interested to hear like what you're excited about, specifically like with what you're doing in your journey there with Blue Grit, both personally and professionally. And is there anything you can share with us that we might be able to expect from you coming down the pipe?
Yeah, for sure, man. So Blue Grit started a few years ago at 2020, right? So I'm talking to my guys about purpose, and then I'm like, well, what is my purpose? What am I doing here? How do I support me and my people and just being positive? And that I went to fitness and things that I fell in love with in the career by necessity in the career, right? So like fitness and mental health, right? So just kind of building it and just knowing it was just going to be a vehicle. And I talked about the podcast earlier, but trying to refine more as to like what I'm doing, right? And so I've already given a nudge to it, but really it's about, I don't know better, I know different, but by sharing my experience and some tools I've learned through the years and bringing in experts, that's really, again, that mission of making better cops, like help you lead yourself. So you can take this example, maybe it works like template, or you just say, hey, that's a cool idea. How can I internalize that idea, right? Because I'm not the uber positive guy all the time that some people like have assigned to me publicly. Like, no, it's hard. You have to be intentional about being positive. You have to snap yourself out of it at times. But what I'm excited about is continue to build the podcast, Blue Grit Radio, and the page. And then I've been working on and pretty close to finishing a course, Get Gritty, which is really a self-guided, self-paced, not self-guided, it's guided by me, a video course with slides, but a self-paced course so you can look at your mindset and evaluate how do you build your mindset and routines. I'm not going to tell you to do this split 4 days a week, right? But how do you make it work for you, especially with the first responder element? Like adaptability is the key, right? We all know people are very motivated, but then when life comes in the way, you got court, you got holdover, right? Like that's where you lose that momentum and then people feel defeated. And it's like, not that. So like it's giving tools and vocabulary to help them build that and kind of teach a man to fish, right? Like that's my goal, is just get information out there so you can be better. Cause I'm on to the next thing. I want to just think about like the next project and what we can do to elevate each other in the community.
I love that, man. And just I think I said this off air or maybe we talked about this a little off air. So I just want to say it publicly, just acknowledging that the podcast world is kind of a funny one in terms of feedback and, having a tough time sometimes understanding how much of your stuff reaches people and in what kind of way do they reach, or what kind of way does it reach them. And you've reached me in several different ways, through your guests, through your podcasts, through your writing, through your Instagram page. I don't see it all the time. There's a lot to see, and there's a lot of noise out there. But when I do, and when I get into it, I'm always able to take away some value, which gets me thinking a little bit differently. And I'm sure it does that for other people. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, man. I love what you're doing. I think you do a fantastic job doing it. I know this podcast, this will reach people in a different way. I don't know how many. I don't think it really matters, but it'll reach somebody, and it certainly has helped me. So I appreciate that.
And that's a valid point. Like if it reaches a few, and I got a lot of value talking to you as I do, right? And so I've said that on a lot of my podcasts when I get to have a very meaningful conversation that helps me develop and get better.
Right.
And the fact that we can share that with anybody is kind of a modern miracle, right?
It's a privilege, and there's a responsibility to that. So I appreciate you and the efforts and the legitimacy you bring to that with regard to taking responsibility for what you're putting out. So I mean, it just makes sense at the end. If people want to find out more about you and find out a little bit more about Blue Grit and what you're doing, and then ultimately follow you through your project there or get involved with that, where do they go, man?
Absolutely. So Blue Grit Radio on all your major players, Apple, Spotify, Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram, and email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. And please go on Ironside Podcast, right? And mine, give a 5-star review. There's so many weird metrics and lack of metrics that if people if you got some value from the show, just go on there and give a little review. It helps the show a ton. So
yeah, it is.
Thank you, man.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much for saying that. I appreciate it. Again, it's kind of a lonely, weird world.
Yeah.
It is. It's a little bit weird. So thanks for sharing your time with me, man. And after a long day, like I said, I've kept you long enough. Hope we can do this again soon. I'm looking forward to hearing the podcast that you're about to put out with Chris and I.
Yeah, man.
In the coming week or weeks here. Excited to listen to that. I encourage everybody to listen to that and get maybe a little bit different perspective, particularly on the fitness side, which was a major part of that.
Fitness standards.
The fitness standards.
Don't get rid of them. Don't lower them.
Right.
Raise them up.
Right. Exactly. So anyway, Eric, thanks very much for your time, buddy. I appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you, man.